windows along with the dust and noise of the street vendors. We were 4 people squeezed into 2 small rooms, a single window facing an alleyway that smelled of garbage and fried fish. Aunt Virginia in her tiny room and the 3 of us, Mama, Father, and I, crammed into the other. The lack of space wasn't the biggest problem, it was the suffocating lack of privacy. I didn't even have a corner to cry alone, to mourn the loss of my innocence and the life I had known. Aunt Virginia was the opposite of Mama in every way. Widowed for years, she ran a small notions shop on her own. She was a woman of firm opinions and an even firmer will, a stark contrast to Mama's quiet, submissive nature. She was the first to notice my belly, which was already becoming difficult to hide beneath my loose dresses. "Sarah, is this girl expecting a child, or am I going blind?" she asked one afternoon while I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink. The silence that followed was heavy and cold, a silence that weighed more than lead. Mama looked at the floor, her trembling hands twisting her apron into a tight knot. "Well, yes, my sister. The disgrace is complete." Aunt Virginia's eyes narrowed with a suspicion that seemed to see right through us. "And who's the father?" Another silence, even heavier. "She won't say," Mama lied, her voice a mere whisper. "One of the farm workers, I think." Aunt Virginia didn't say anything, but I could tell she didn't believe Mama. Her gaze on me was sharp and knowing, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel judged. I felt seen. The following week, without telling anyone, she came home with a man in a black suit with a leather bag under his arm. A real doctor, not those healers we consulted back in the country. "Dr. Wilson is going to examine George," she announced. My heart sank. What would he say about Father? What would he say about me? "I don't want anyone sick in my house," Aunt Virginia declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. Father, who spent his days sitting on a bench in the yard, staring at nothing and talking to himself, barely reacted when the doctor examined him. He answered some questions in a weak voice. He let the doctor measure his pressure, look at his tongue, and tap his knees with that little rubber hammer. Then it was my turn. Mama tried to stay in the room, but Aunt Virginia was firm. "Let the doctor work, Sarah. Go make some coffee for us." Alone with the doctor, I trembled with fear. I had never been examined like this by a strange man, especially not in my current state. But Dr. Wilson was gentle, respectful, and kind. He explained everything he was going to do before he did it, his voice a calm balm to my racing heart. When he finished the examination, his eyes had a sadness that made me lower mine. "Do you know who the father is?" he asked softly. I shook my head, denying it. I was too ashamed to tell the truth, too afraid of what he would think. "How far along are you?" "About 4 months, I think." "And do you want to keep the pregnancy?" The question caught me by surprise. No one had asked me that before. Mama simply assumed I should get rid of the child. Father didn't know or pretended not to know. And here was this man, this kind doctor, treating the decision as if it were mine alone. "I do," I answered softly but firmly. He nodded, wrote something on a paper, and gave it to me. "These are vitamins. You're weak, anemic. You need to eat better for the baby." When we left the room, Mama and Aunt Virginia were waiting in the living room, tense as 2 violin strings tuned too tight. Dr. Wilson got straight to the point. "Your husband, Mrs. Malachi, has a severe nervous disorder. He needs to be admitted to the sanitarium for proper treatment." "Sanitarium?" Mama repeated, horrified. "The madhouse?" "Psychiatric hospital is the correct term," the doctor patiently corrected. "He's having delusions, hallucinations, probably triggered by grief, but which can worsen if not treated. As for your daughter," he continued, glancing at me with a pained expression, "she needs prenatal care. She's anemic and malnourished." It was as if a bomb had exploded in that small room. Aunt Virginia put her hands on her hips, staring at her sister with an expression of cold fury. "Sarah, tell me it's not what I'm thinking." Mama collapsed in a chair, defeated, the color draining from her face. What did you want me to do, Virginia? He's my husband, her father. And that gives him the right to. Aunt Virginia didn't finish the sentence, too horrified by the implications. She turned to the doctor, her voice now a low growl. Doctor, what happened to my niece? It's a crime, isn't it? The doctor looked from one to the other, finally understanding what no one was saying openly. If it's what I'm thinking, yes, it's one of the most serious crimes. And it is a crime I am legally obligated to report. I'll call the police, Aunt Virginia continued, tears of anger in her eyes. You can, the doctor replied hesitantly. But think about what this will mean for the young lady, for the baby that will be born. This kind of situation usually becomes a public scandal. Gossip. And what do you suggest? My aunt asked, her voice trembling with emotion. The man needs to be institutionalized. That's certain. We can do the hospitalization papers without mentioning the other matter. Just say that he has delusions, that he tried to burn down the house, that he represents a danger to himself and others. And so it was that on a rainy February morning in 1959, two men in white coats came to get my father. He didn't even resist. He was so immersed in his own madness that he hardly noticed what was happening. He got into the ambulance, looking at the sky, searching for something in the gray clouds, whispering Jeremy's name. When the ambulance turned the corner, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, as if I could finally breathe after months of suffocating. I looked at Mama, expecting to see the same relief. But what I saw was something else. A mixture of guilt, shame, and what hurt me most, anger. Anger directed at me. Satisfied, she whispered when Aunt Virginia went into the house. Now everyone will know. How could you do this to your own father? I was speechless. How could she blame me? How could she defend that man after everything he had done? But I soon understood. Mama was a product of an era when women were trained from an early age to accept, to be silent, to endure. Men are like that. Women have to endure. You did something to provoke him. These were phrases I had heard all my life, phrases that had been etched into my mother's soul. He raped his own daughter, Mama, I said quietly, using the right word for the first time for what had happened. And you knew. You let it happen. She slapped me across the face, the only one she ever gave me in my entire life. Her hand left a searing mark on my cheek. Never repeat that again. Your father is sick. He doesn't know what he's doing. Aunt Virginia appeared at the kitchen door, attracted by the shouts. If you hit her one more time, Sarah, it's you who leave this house, not her. It was the beginning of a Cold War that lasted for months. Mama barely spoke to me, as if I had betrayed the family by allowing father to be hospitalized. She spent the day crying in corners, visited him at the sanitarium whenever she could, and came back saying he was improving, that he would soon return home to our family. Meanwhile, my belly was growing. Aunt Virginia took me to appointments with Dr. Wilson, bought me fabric to make maternity clothes, and even began to prepare a cradle for the baby. She took it upon herself to explain my situation to the neighbors and acquaintances. She invented a story that I was a widow, that my husband had died in a farm accident shortly after the wedding. In those days, being a widow was more acceptable than being an unwed mother. It was during one of these appointments, already in the 6th month of pregnancy, that Dr. Wilson gave me news that changed everything. Miss Dorothy, you are expecting twins. I almost fell off the chair. Twins. 2 children to raise alone in a time when I could barely imagine how I would raise one. Are you sure, doctor? Absolutely. You can hear 2 distinct little heartbeats. I left the office dazed, my hands on my belly, which now made more sense. It was too big for the stage of pregnancy. Aunt Virginia, who was waiting for me in the waiting room, saw my face and immediately asked what had happened. It's 2, Auntie, 2 babies. She widened her eyes, made the sign of the cross, and then to my surprise, opened a smile. God knows what he's doing, girl. It will be difficult, but we'll manage. That night, lying in the narrow bed I shared with Mama, who slept with her back to me as always, I felt the babies moving for the first time. It wasn't that weak tremor I had already felt before. These were kicks, punches, complete somersaults, as if they were talking, playing in there. I cried silently, my hands on my belly, feeling my children alive, strong despite everything. At that moment, I made a decision. These children would never know the truth about how they were conceived. They would never carry the weight of that knowledge. I would invent a father for them, a good, hard-working man who had died before meeting them. A merciful lie to protect them from the terrible truth. Mama, whom I thought was asleep, suddenly spoke, still with her back to me. "What are you going to do when these children are born, Dorothy? How will you raise them? With what money?" "I don't know, Mama. I just know they're my children and I'll love them." "And when your father comes back, what will you say to him?" I felt a shiver down my spine. I hadn't thought of that. In the last few months, I had almost managed to forget that father existed, that one day he could leave the sanitarium, return to our lives. "He won't come back, Mama. Not to my life. Never again." She finally turned, her eyes shining in the darkness. "He is your father, Dorothy. His blood runs in your veins, in the veins of these children. There's no escape from that." Her words haunted me in the days that followed. What if she was right? What if there was no escape from blood, from inheritance, from the curse? What if my children were born already marked, condemned to repeat the errors of their father, grandfather? It was Aunt Virginia who saved me from this well of dark thoughts. "Nonsense," she said when I finally had the courage to share my fears. "Blood curse is ignorant people's talk. What makes a person is character, choices, not blood. Look at me and your mother. Same parents, same upbringing, and we're as different as water and oil. But what if they're born different, with some problem? If they are, we love them just the same and take care of them and teach them right from wrong, which is what your parents didn't know how to do with your father." At the end of July 1959, when Charleston was preparing for Independence Day, I felt the first contractions. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I woke with a pain that seemed to split my belly in half. Mama wasn't home. She had gone to spend a few days at the sanitarium with father, who according to her was having a worse crisis than the previous ones. Aunt Virginia, always practical, had already arranged everything with an experienced midwife who lived 2 blocks down. In 20 minutes, Mrs. O'Leary was at my side, examining me with calloused but gentle hands, guiding me through the pains that increased with each minute. "It's going to be a difficult birth, girl," she warned. "There are 2 and they're coming a bit sideways. You'll need strength." Strength was something I had learned to have in recent months. The 16 hours of labor that followed were the hardest of my life up to that point. But when I finally heard the cry of the first baby, followed minutes later by the second, it was all worth it. 2 boys, announced Mrs. O'Leary, placing the little ones wrapped in clean towels in my arms, strong as bulls, despite having come early. I looked at those red, wrinkled, perfect faces and saw no shadow of my father in them. Just new, pure life waiting to be written. I cried with relief, with joy, with fear, with everything together. "What will you name them?" asked Aunt Virginia, tears also streaming down her wrinkled face. I hadn't thought of names for boys. I was certain they would be girls for some reason. I looked at the 2, so alike and yet so different at the same time. "Emmanuel and Samuel," I replied without thinking much. Bible names that meant God with us and heard by God. Because despite everything, I still wanted to believe that God hadn't completely abandoned me. In the days following the twins' birth, a strange peace settled in me, as if I finally understood that the brutal life I had lived until then had a purpose, to bring these 2 beings into the world, to care for them, protect them, and love them. It was also when the idea of revenge began to grow in me. Not a violent, bloody revenge, but something more subtle, more definitive, something that would free not only me, but also my mother and my children from the yoke of that man who had destroyed so many lives. The opportunity would come sooner than I imagined, and in a way I could never have predicted. But before it arrived, I would have to face my mother's last great silence. A silence that, unlike the others, would be eternal. The first months with the twins were a challenge greater than anything I had ever faced. Sleepless nights, crying that wouldn't stop, cloth diapers that needed to be washed and boiled every day, cracked breasts from nursing two hungry babies. But unlike the pains I carried before, these were pains that brought purpose, that made me stronger each day. Aunt Virginia was an angel during this time. Even with her advanced age, she would wake up in the middle of the night to help me with the boys. She taught me old tricks to calm colic, to make the babies burp, even invented a double sling so I could carry both at once when I needed to go to the market or to church. Mama returned from the sanitarium 3 weeks after the twins' birth. She entered the house silently, looked at the babies sleeping in the improvised cradle, and didn't say a word. She seemed older, more hunched, as if the weight of the world had doubled on her shoulders. "How is father?" I asked, more out of politeness than interest. "Worse," she responded simply. "The doctors say there's no more hope, that he'll be institutionalized for the rest of his life." I felt such great relief upon hearing that, I was ashamed. After all, we were talking about my father, the man who raised me, whom I once loved and respected. But the truth is that the prospect of him never leaving that place, never being able to hurt us again, was like taking an enormous weight off my shoulders. "Did the doctor say anything else?" asked Aunt Virginia, bringing a coffee for her sister. Mama hesitated, glanced at me, then lowered her eyes to the coffee steaming in the china cup. "They said he has a disease in his brain that gets progressively worse. That one day he won't recognize anyone anymore or be able to take care of himself." "What disease is that?" I insisted, curious. "I don't remember the name exactly. Starts with AP or something." Years later, when I was working at the hospital, I discovered that it was probably general paresis, a neurological complication of advanced stage syphilis, a disease he must have contracted in his wanderings through the region's brothels and which, untreated for years, ended up affecting his brain, contributing to the madness that had been fermenting in him since Jeremy's death. In those first months of 1960, with my children growing strong despite being born premature, I began to think about the future. I couldn't continue depending on Aunt Virginia's charity forever. I needed to work, earn my own money, provide a roof and food for my boys. That's when an opportunity arose at the city hospital. They needed young women to work as nursing assistants, washing patients, changing sheets, and feeding those who were more debilitated. The work was hard and paid little, but it had one advantage: they offered a small room at the back of the hospital for employees who lived far away. Aunt Virginia encouraged me to try. "It will be good for you, girl. Learn a profession. Be independent. The boys stay with me while you work. Then we'll take turns." Mama, on the other hand, was horrified by the idea. Working in the hospital with sick people, injuries, people dying. That's not work for a family girl. "And what do you suggest, Mama? That I remain dependent on Aunt Virginia for the rest of my life? Or that I hastily find a husband to support not only me, but also 2 children who aren't even his?" She didn't respond, but I realized I had touched on a sensitive point. In her mind, the only dignified solution to my situation was to marry. But what man in those days would accept a woman with 2 small children with no known father? The chances were minimal, and even if some suitor appeared, it would probably be out of interest in the land that father still owned back home. Land that was legally still his despite the hospitalization. I got the job at the hospital and started 2 weeks later. It was difficult at first. The smell of disinfectant, the patient's pain, the moans during the night. But I soon got used to it. I discovered I had a knack for it. I had gentle hands to clean wounds, a firm but kind voice to calm the agitated, and courage to face situations that made other employees faint. In 6 months, I had already been promoted to a real nursing assistant. One of the head nurses, Mrs. Olivia, took me under her protection. She was a lady in her 50s who had never married, dedicating her life to the profession. She taught me everything she knew: how to give injections, measure blood pressure, recognize symptoms of common diseases, and calm difficult patients. "You have a gift, girl," she would say. "You could be a real nurse with a diploma and everything. There's a school in Richmond." The idea was planted in my head, but it still seemed too distant a dream. How would I study in Richmond with two small children to raise? Where would I get money for the school, for housing in a big city? The twins turned 1 year old and were already babbling their first words, taking uncertain steps, holding on to furniture, filling the house with joy. Aunt Virginia adored them, called them her little grandsons, told stories, and made cloth dolls for them to play with. Even Mama, who initially barely looked at the babies, began to grow attached. I saw her once cradling Samuel, singing softly a lullaby she used to sing to me when I was little, and I felt a tightness in my chest. Despite everything, she was still my mother. It was during this time that I met Robert, a young pharmacist who had opened a small pharmacy near the hospital. He would always come to deliver medications to the ward, and we started talking. He was an educated, gentle man from a good family. Soon we were having dates, always accompanied, of course, as the custom of the time demanded. He knew about my situation, that I was a widow with two small children, and didn't seem to mind. "I admire your courage," he told me once as we walked in the park after Sunday Mass, raising two children alone, working at the hospital, facing people's prejudice. Not just any woman would do that. For a moment, I allowed myself to dream. Maybe he was the fresh start I had been waiting for. Maybe we could form a family. Him, me, Emmanuel, and Samuel. A real family based on respect and affection, not on fear and abuse. But fate, once again, had other plans. On a cold May morning in 1961, I was called urgently to the ward. A new patient had arrived in serious condition. When I entered the room and saw who it was, my blood froze in my veins. It was Mama. Pale as wax, with bluish lips, breathing with difficulty. "What happened?" I asked the nurse attending to her. "Heart problem, it seems." Her sister brought her in. Said she collapsed in the kitchen suddenly. I ran to her side, took her cold hand. "Mama, it's me, Dorothy. Can you hear me?" She opened her eyes slowly, focusing on me with difficulty. "Dorothy, forgive me." "Forgive what, Mama?" "Don't talk now. Just rest. I need to tell you." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone so debilitated. "Your father, he isn't." She didn't finish the sentence. Her eyes rolled back. Her entire body shook in a violent convulsion, and then she was still. The doctors tried to revive her, but it was too late. "A sudden, massive heart attack," they said later. Quick and with no chance of survival. I stood there holding her still warm hand, trying to understand what she wanted to tell me in her last moments. "Your father, he isn't." "Isn't what?" The incomplete phrase would haunt me for months, years, until I finally discovered the truth she almost took to the grave. The funeral was simple, as Jeremy's had been, except this time it was raining. A fine drizzle that seemed like tears from heaven. Aunt Virginia cried a lot, clinging to my arm. The twins, too young to understand what was happening, stayed at home with a neighbor. After Mama's death, something changed inside me. It was as if a last cord that tied me to the past had broken. Now it was just me, my children, and whatever future we could build. And of course, one last matter to resolve. My father, still institutionalized, still a shadow hanging over our lives. Aunt Virginia called me for a serious conversation a week after the funeral. "Dorothy, there's something your mother asked me to tell you if anything happened to her. I promised I wouldn't speak while she was alive, but now." I sat down, my heart racing, the old fear mixed with a new, frantic curiosity. Could this be the continuation of that last sentence interrupted by death? "It's about your father," she continued, her voice trembling. "About what he did to you?" I asked, a lump in my throat. "You already know about that, Auntie." "It's not that. It's about who he really is." She paused, took a deep breath as if gathering the courage to jump from a great height. George is not your biological father, Dorothy. It was as if the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet. It wasn't possible. There had to be some mistake. What do you mean? Of course he is. He always was. Mama never. Your mother was 16 when she met a young man from the city, a law student who was on vacation in the area. They fell in love. And well, you know how these things happen. When your mother discovered she was pregnant, the young man had already returned to Richmond. Her family, my parents, were furious. They arranged a hasty marriage with George, who was a foreman on the neighboring farm and had an interest in the land my father would leave as inheritance. I listened to all of this as if in a dream or a nightmare. He agreed to marry her, knowing Mama was pregnant by another man. He agreed on the condition that no one would ever know the truth, that the child, you, would be registered as his daughter. And so it was done. And my real father, did he never know about me? Aunt Virginia shook her head sadly. Your mother tried to contact him when she found out she was pregnant. She sent a letter and never got a response. Years later, we learned he had married a girl from a good family, become a judge, and moved to Washington, D.C. 1,000 questions exploded in my head. Why had Mama never told me? Why keep this secret until death? And if my biological father was alive out there somewhere, not knowing he had a daughter and 2 grandsons, why had Mama never told me, especially after what happened? Aunt Virginia held my hands in hers, her eyes full of an ancient sadness. I think it was shame, my child, and fear. Fear that you would blame her for hiding this. Fear that you would go looking for this man and discover that he never wanted to know about you. And then when George did what he did, I think she became even more afraid that you would think she had let it happen because he wasn't your real father. Suddenly everything made a new, terrible sense. Father's hateful look when I was born a girl when he was expecting a boy. His obsession with Jeremy, his only real son. The ease with which he crossed that forbidden line, violating the daughter he never truly considered his own. And Mama, her silence, her guilt, her inability to protect me, everything now had a new layer of meaning. It wasn't just fear of a violent husband. It was fear that a secret kept for decades would come to light. That night, alone in my little room at the back of the hospital, I cried all the tears I still had to cry. For the girl I was, for the mother I lost, for the father I never knew. For the children who now carried the blood of a man who wasn't even my real father. When the sun rose, an idea had formed in my head. An idea so perfect, so just, so deliciously vindictive that I almost smiled thinking about it. The revenge I had dreamed of for so long was now within my reach, and it would be more complete than I had ever imagined. To execute it, however, I would need help, and the right person for that had just entered my life. Robert, the young pharmacist who increasingly seemed interested in building a future with me, despite my complicated past. What I didn't know was that my revenge would end up taking a turn that I couldn't have imagined, even in my wildest dreams, and that the price to pay would be much higher than I was prepared to accept. The revelation that George was not my biological father changed everything. It was as if a confusing puzzle finally showed its complete image. The pieces fit together. Why he always favored Jeremy, why he looked at me with that disguised anger even when I was small, why he crossed that unforgivable line so easily. In his sick mind, I wasn't really his daughter. I was just the living proof of my mother's betrayal, an intruder in the family he was forced to accept. My plan for revenge was born from this revelation. It wouldn't be a bloody revenge. I wouldn't stain my hands as he had stained his soul. It would be something more sophisticated, more complete, something that would take from him the only thing that still mattered, his name, his inheritance, his legacy. Robert and I grew closer during this time. He was a different man from all I had ever known. Educated, gentle, and patient with my children. When I finally found the courage and told him my whole story. The real one, not the widow version everyone believed, I expected to see disgust, rejection. But what I saw was compassion and a righteous anger directed not at me but at George. This man needs to pay for what he did, Dorothy, Robert said, holding my hands. Not just to you, but to your mother, to the children. He's already paying, I replied. Locked up in that sanitarium, losing his mind more and more. But it's not enough. I want him to know he completely failed, that he left nothing in this world. Robert immediately understood what I meant. As a pharmacist, he knew doctors, lawyers, and people who could help us with what we were planning. And so we began our journey to legally destroy the man who had destroyed my childhood. The first step was to find a lawyer in Richmond, a childhood friend of Robert's named Mr. Jennings. I explained my situation, the truth about my birth, the abuse I suffered, the twins who were born from that violence, and my desire to cut any legal connection with George. "What exactly do you want, ma'am?" asked the lawyer after listening to everything in silence. "I want to change my name and my children's names. I don't want anything from that man. Not the surname, not the land, not a penny of the money. I want it to be as if we never existed for him." Mr. Jennings explained it would be complicated. We would need to prove that George was not my biological father, which without a paternity test, a rare thing in those days, would be almost impossible. We would have to prove the abuse, which would mean exposing the whole story in court, subjecting myself to public scrutiny and judgment. "Are you sure you want to go through this, Miss Dorothy? It will be painful, and the children, one day they'll grow up and ask questions." "I'm sure," I replied without hesitation. "I prefer that my children know the truth when they're old enough to understand rather than grow up carrying the name of a monster." While we prepared the legal process, I continued working at the hospital. It was there that I met Dr. Thomas, a young doctor who came to work in the psychiatric ward. We soon became friends. I helped with his consultations. He taught me about mental illnesses and the new treatments. One afternoon while we were talking about a patient, I mentioned that my father was institutionalized in a sanitarium in Charleston. "What a coincidence," he said. "I'm visiting that sanitarium next week. I'm doing research on treatments for chronic patients." "What's his name?" I hesitated for a moment, but something told me I could trust this doctor. "George Malaki." "But he's not my father." "Not really." I told the whole story once again. Dr. Thomas listened attentively without judgment. "If I may be so bold, Miss Dorothy, I think I can help with your legal process. It would be useful to have an updated medical report on Mr. Malaki's mental state. I can do this assessment when I go to the sanitarium if you authorize it." It was as if fate was conspiring in my favor. A week later, Dr. Thomas returned from the sanitarium with news that exceeded all expectations. "Mr. Malachi is in an advanced state of paralytic dementia, probably caused by untreated syphilis. He barely recognizes where he is, confuses people, and has constant delusions. According to the nurses, he calls for Jeremy all the time, believing his son is alive and comes to visit him." "Did he ask about me or my mother?" The doctor hesitated as if pondering how much he should say. "Actually, he doesn't remember you. When I mentioned your name, he asked who that was. When I explained you were his daughter, he became agitated. He said he never had a daughter, only a son named Jeremy." That hurt more than I expected. Even after everything, a part of me still wanted to have existed for him, if only as an object of hatred. Being completely forgotten seemed worse somehow. But Dr. Thomas's report was crucial for our process. With the medical certification that George was permanently mentally incapacitated, incompetent, and with no prospect of improvement, we were able to move forward with the name change request without needing his consent. In September 1962, I finally received the news I had been waiting for. The judge had granted my request. My children and I could adopt a new surname. I chose Wilson, Robert's surname. It was as if I were honoring the only person who had truly supported me when I needed it most. Dorothy Wilson, I repeated to myself, savoring each syllable. Emmanuel and Samuel Wilson. It sounded good, sounded clean, new, without the weight of the bloody history we carried before. But my revenge wouldn't be complete with just that. There was still the matter of the land, the material inheritance that George valued so much. The land where I grew up, where Jeremy was buried, where so many tragedies had occurred. A part of me just wanted to give it all up. I didn't want to touch anything that belonged to that man. But Robert, in his quiet wisdom, convinced me otherwise. "This is not about the money, Dorothy," he said. "It's about taking back what was rightfully yours." My revenge would be to take from him the one thing that still mattered, his legacy. We hired a team of lawyers to find and track down all the Malachi family properties. It was a long, arduous process. We discovered that after my mother's death, what was left of the hardware store and the land had been sold to a neighbor to pay off a pile of long-forgotten debts that George had made during his fits of rage. But my father still had the original farm, the 30 acres where I had grown up, where my brother was buried. That piece of land, a constant source of pain and suffering, was now rotting away, a ghost of its former self. I bought it. It was a victory more satisfying than any court ruling. I was not just Dorothy Wilson now. I was a landowner. I was a woman who had taken a life of pain and turned it into a life of purpose. I eventually expanded my business. What started as a small, humble pie stand at a local market grew into a successful chain of bakeries. My twin boys, Emmanuel and Samuel, grew up to be strong, kind, and hard-working men. We never talked about George, and they grew up believing the story I had fabricated, that their father, Robert, had died in an accident. My revenge was complete. I had not just survived. I had triumphed. I was a woman who had built an empire from the ashes of her past, a life so full of light that it would cast a shadow over my father's darkness. Today, at 84 years old, I am not just a survivor. I am a testament to the fact that you can not only endure the worst nightmares, but also use them to create a life of beauty and purpose. The pain of my past is not a burden. It is a part of me, a reminder of the strength I had to find within myself. My father's legacy of hate and cruelty died with him. But my legacy of resilience, of kindness, and of love lives on in my bakeries, in the smiles of the children, and in the hearts of the people of Stonehenge. My name is Dorothy Malachi Wilson. But everyone here in this little spot in the middle of nowhere knows me as Grandma Di, the old lady who sold homemade pies and told stories of a world that was gone forever. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope my words find those who need to hear that it is possible to survive even the worst nightmares. Please subscribe to the Stories of Grand Women channel and like this video if it moved you. Remember, some serpents die from their own venom, and some are crushed by the very prey they tried to swallow. My father tried to swallow me, but he choked on his own evil.